Hello everyone, delighted to be here today. Thank you very much to IWEA for the invitation. Obviously the last few years we've had a lot of development in the UK, and I've been looking across the Irish Sea at the sort of false starts that we've had that people mentioned earlier. So it's really great to be here and see the industry taking shape in Ireland. So I'll just start off with a bit of an overview of where we are at the moment in the UK. Just that's slightly out of date. We're actually over 8 gigawatts now of capacity, and we're generating just under about 10% of the UK's electricity, around 11,000 jobs, and exports in the range of about £500 million a year. Now, when we look ahead to 2030, the industry has a really strong vision, and that's been set out in the sector deal, which we agreed with the government just earlier this year. It's a sort of first of its kind document in the world where you have a government really committing to putting offshore wind at the heart of its energy policy. And for 2030, what we're looking at is at least 30 gigawatts of offshore wind operational, supplying over a third of the UK's requirements, and that trebling of jobs, near trebling of jobs to 27,000 a year, and a five-fold increase in exports. And if we then look at, in the shorter term, how that's panning out, we've got here this is a graph from the Offshore Wind Project Intelligence database that RenewableUK runs, and this looks at deployment in the next 5 years. And you can see there's a mix there of things that are under construction at the moment, things that are in pre-construction, and then there's things that are eligible for the next round of contract for difference auctions. And you can see there that projection across 5 years brings us up to, just around 16 gigawatts. And I think the only thing to note there is that the uncertainty that we have in this graph is actually more at the upper end. So if there's to be uncertainty, it's likely that we'll get more than that depending on the results of the next auction. So why are we going so strongly on offshore wind in the UK? And a big answer to that is the policy context, obviously. The UK has set a net zero target, so by 2050 we're going to be a net zero economy, and that's going to require a huge leap in the amount of renewable electricity that we're generating, about a fourfold increase. And it's clear from all the analysis that we get from serious modelers and energy experts that renewables will dominate the future power system. And at the moment, again, the uncertainty is around what the upper end is. So is it going to be more 80% renewables in the UK, or will it be slightly lower or even higher than that? So just here we illustrate a range of different scenarios from National Grid, Committee on Climate Change, and the Energy Department itself. And contracts for difference that we have in the UK, that is the main driver and the main policy mechanism to deliver new renewable capacity. And we have a commitment from government as of last year that for offshore wind, those will be held every other year. We're going to have continued auctions throughout the 2020s. So if we just take a little look at what the main features of the scheme are, and a lot of this will be familiar from some of the things that were set out by Noel, but in some ways it diverges. So the eligibility criteria are fairly straightforward. It's about having planning consent, a valid grid connection agreement, and also having an agreement for lease with the Crown Estate who own the seabed. We also run it as just a price-only competition. So in the assessment of how contracts are allocated and who wins, we only look at those price impacts. There are other ways in which projects set out what their impact might be on local supply chains and stimulating economic activity, but that doesn't sit within the actual assessment criteria. And the reference price that we use is based on a future wholesale price forecast. When it comes to the actual contracts themselves, once you secure a contract, there's a 12-month milestone delivery date, and at that point you have to have made financial close, reach final investment decision, or you need to have spent 10% of the overall project spend. And as I mentioned, it's going to be every 2 years, and we have a pot structure so that onshore wind, solar, and other more mature renewables, as they're known, they sit in one pot for allocation, and the second pot, that is offshore wind, tidal stream, and a number of other fuels, renewable technologies. And you can just see there that we've had 2 allocation rounds so far, 2 auctions delivering contracts, and this just covers which years those projects will deliver in. The 3rd allocation round, which we'll get results for next week, those projects will deliver from 2023 to 2025. So far, we've had 2 successful auctions. I'll just run through quickly. The first one, we had a budget of £325 million, 315 million of which was allocated in the end, and we got 1.2 gigawatts of offshore wind at a strike price of £115 a megawatt hour. So obviously that's significantly higher than where prices are at the moment, but that even represented quite a significant fall in costs compared to the previous contracts that were awarded not on a competitive basis. And there was other technologies that were successful as part of that auction as well, including onshore wind. In the second auction that we did in 2017, we saw a really dramatic price fall there, just around 50% cost reduction between the first and second allocation rounds. Onshore wind and solar were ineligible for that. That was only an auction for Pot 2 technologies, and we got 3 offshore wind farms there. And prices ranged from the lowest was £57.50 to there was one project which got about £74.50 a megawatt hour. And we don't know because we don't have the exact bid stack. That's all confidential. We don't know exactly who bid what, but I think there's been quite a little bit of speculation that actually that offshore wind price for that last project may have been brought up by a small fuels technology project, and that was to do with how the auction was structured. So one of the lessons there was about unintended consequences around decisions you make on these technologies and how you structure an auction. So just looking ahead now to the next allocation round, which we're going to get the results for next week. There have been a few innovations in this one and how it's structured and how it's run. Notably, we now have remote island wind included. So those are onshore wind turbines or onshore wind projects that are located in remote islands, particularly the outer Scottish islands, recognizing the additional costs of connection and transmission in those locations. And that was supported by the Conservatives going into the last election and the 2015 election. They'll be delivering 23, 24 and 25. There's a £65 million budget, which is quite low, obviously compared to where the budgets for these auctions were set previously. There's no specific technology minima or maxima. There's an overall cap that this auction round will procure 6 gigawatts maximum. We also have some changes to how the costs have been calculated. So we've increased the load factor assumptions as was shown previously on the slides. As the turbines have grown, load factors have increased, and I think BEIS are using an offshore wind load factor of about 58% for this one, which is quite a jump. And there's also a different reference price been introduced for variable technologies like wind. Again, that recognizes some of the cannibalization and price capture and capture price effects of having a high degree of variable renewables on the system. So in terms of what we're going to get next week in the auctions, we don't know, and sadly I'm not allowed to speculate wildly, but we do know that we're going to get a record amount of capacity at record low prices. The administrative strike prices, so the max that projects are allowed to bid, are, depending on your delivery years, are £56 per megawatt hour and £53 a megawatt hour. And really, when we look back, the story of the CFD and offshore wind has been about unexpected and rapid cost reduction. So what we have here on the slide is the administrative strike prices is the green line of where they were set, and the blue line is the outrun of where they actually delivered. Then when we look forward, we've got obviously our £56 and £53 max for this auction. And I should say that the red line there is not us forecasting what the prices are going to be. That's just if you take the cost projection to date and you do a linear modeling of that, that's the kind of trajectory that you get. But whether prices fall further, we'll have to wait next week to see where they end up. And here I just wanted to take a moment to talk about some of the drivers of price reduction that we've seen. And as you can see here, one of the biggest is the reduction in the cost of capital. So a 1% reduction in the cost of capital translates into about a 4% decrease in your strike price. And this cost of capital, that was when we started talking about CFDs about 7-8 years ago. Reducing the cost of capital was one of the key aims of the policy. We've been successful at doing that. And then we can also look at the load factor. As we've gotten bigger turbines, that's also contributed in the downward cost trajectory. And that's kind of also been one of the key figures of the evolution of the CFD scheme. We're now getting much bigger turbines. I mean, 5 years ago, I think in the UK, the biggest turbines that were being installed, about 3.6 megawatts. Now there's currently nothing going in the water that's under 7 megawatts. And in 5 years' time, you wouldn't expect anything less than 10 megawatts to be going in as well. So just to pull out and give the big picture again, where has this process of bringing forward CFDs and the investment in offshore wind in the UK, where has that left us? There's two stories, I think, that are the big answers. One is speed. So it took us 11 years to build the first 2 gigawatts of offshore wind in the UK. We built the last 2 gigawatts just in the last 18 months. And that's a rate of growth that's in line with all of those trends about, technology when it comes to consumer tech, etc. It's a rate of growth that you more associate with that than large infrastructure projects. And we are a very large infrastructure pipeline. So there on the bottom graph, you have the Treasury's National Infrastructure Pipeline, and the offshore wind is the fourth largest program over that period of 4 years. So it is it's a huge industry in the UK, and it's one with growing economic and political significance. So just to finish on a couple of thoughts on where next. Floating offshore wind is a big priority in the UK. We have done a lot of work at that at RenewableUK, and we're soon bringing out our floating offshore wind vision paper. And that's going to set out how we think we can take the next step in floating offshore, following on from Equinor's High Wind project and other developments in different parts of the world. And we see floating as a huge opportunity to open up new areas of the seabed. You also get load factor benefits from going into those deeper waters further offshore. And also in terms of reaching the kind of levels that we need by 2050 to do net zero, floating really helps with the geographical distribution across the UK of that offshore capacity. And then finally, where next is around zero subsidy, or what we can consider to be zero subsidy. Because obviously, when they're allocating these contracts, the subsidy element is counted as the expected top-up from the reference price to the strike price. There we have the trajectory of where costs have gone in the last few years with the auction results, and you can see with the reference price is getting tantalizingly close to the strike prices. That if and when we reach that position where the two intersect, that then opens a number of questions. Do we continue to need these contracts? The answer to which would be yes, because we don't get prices this low unless we have the certainty that those contracts offer. Also, there is a question then, how do we allocate? Because if the budget is no longer the mechanism that's constraining allocation of contracts, are you then doing it just on the basis of volume and how much we need to meet targets? And there's a question there about how is that decided? Is it just government? Is there other advisory bodies that can play a role in that? And then there's also a final question of what do we do with the remaining budget? Do we use that to support innovative technologies like floating, offshore wind or tidal stream, and follow the lesson of offshore wind that if you invest early and help de-risk and bring down the cost of capital, that you can have very successful industries? Obviously, in the way I've framed the question, my answer will be yes. So those are just a couple of thoughts that I wanted to finish on. And I'm also aware that it's September 2019, and I'm talking about the UK market in Dublin, and I haven't mentioned Brexit once, so you can all ask me questions about that in the Q&A. Thank you.